It's a bonus edition of the Book Club for Kids. Hi, I'm Kitty Feldy. Last week, we discussed Jasmine Warga's novel in verse, Other Words for Home. This week, we continue the conversation with our writer, starting with why did she choose to write the novel in verse?
So I initially didn't write the book in verse. I wrote it in prose. My previous two books have been in prose. I've always thought of myself as a prose novelist. Poetry is a huge part of my reading life, and I have friends who I consider to be like legit poets, and I've never really considered myself to be a poet. But I was really struggling to find Jude's voice. And Other Words for Home is a book that I think succeeds or doesn't succeed based on whether the reader feels an attachment to Jude's voice. And in making the choice to change the book into being in verse, I feel like what it did is it highlighted Jude's voice, and it also broke the barrier that I was struggling with of feeling like Jude's voice didn't sound the way that I wanted it to sound. I was able to capture this cadence and sort of textural quality that I hadn't been able in prose. There's a certain suspension of disbelief, right, that I'm asking of the reader, and that you're reading this story in English with the understanding that a lot of it would be told in Arabic. But I wanted to be able to capture sort of the lyricality of Arabic and the cadence of Arabic. And by putting the book into verse, I feel like I was able to do that a little bit. And also able to, in the scenes when she's come to America, sort of indicate the pauses that she feels as she's absorbing all this new information, this new language. And so I feel like the form of verse held this particular story really well. And that's what you're always searching for, is like what is going to be the best vehicle to tell the story. The advantages are those, all the things that I talked about of sort of highlighting voice, giving immediacy to character, and the cadence and the lyricality that is inherent in poetry and verse. The negatives are that the limited word economy that you're given. So for building characters, particularly secondary characters, it can really be a challenge because you don't want to mess up the rhythm of the book by weighing it down too much with too much information. And so you really have to make every word count that you're using to tell to tell your reader about a secondary character. So I feel like there's just less space to make the secondary characters come alive. And so it's really important to choose the details wisely and work with what you have for characterization. And I also think that verse novels aren't well suited for things with really complex, meaty plots. Like I would not write a mystery novel in verse. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. It will probably be done by someone who has a skill set that I don't have. But I think of verse novels as being really great for emotional stakes novels, where the plot is really about how the character feels about themselves and the world and finding their voice. And that, I think the structure holds that well. I think, a really high fantasy novel that has multiple plot threads, a verse novel just isn't probably the right form for that.
Well, what are the limitations of writing a novel in verse?
Yeah, I guess the limitations were so many different scenes that I had to cut and so many different words because I'd written the whole book out in prose. I was really far along with it. And so there are scenes and details that I just had to remove because you have such more limited words, because you don't want a book, especially when you're writing for younger readers, to be 700 pages. And with verse, it's just you have less words to use. And so the real limitation is, can I cut this extra scene about the play? Because nobody wants to read 5 poems about a play tryout, right? You just have less space, whereas in the prose version, that was just one chapter because you have more space. So it was about picking what is the detail that's really going to pop and make this stick for the reader and make them understand what this experience is like for Jude. And so everything feels more high stakes than it does in prose. Not that I don't care about the word choice when I'm writing in prose, of course I do, but those decisions at a grainier level felt much more high stakes than they do in something where I just have many more chances to make sure the reader understands.
The book involves a family from Syria And you yourself have said that your family is not from Syria. So how do you balance writing this book with the call for own voices at this time?
The first thing I will say is I think I was always very clear in the author's note and once it came to talking about the book that this is not an own voices novel by any means, and that I have never been a refugee, let alone an immigrant. And so right there, I was writing outside of my own experience. I think when it comes to whether my family is Syrian or not, that is a little bit different. I really feel like the Levant Arab countries of like Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, it's a very, there are obviously distinctions and the countries are different in topography. And so that was also, I had to do lots of research. I had to talk to the aforementioned family friends. I had to talk to other people in the Syrian community to make sure I was representing the country of Syria correctly. But culturally, I feel like there are more similarities than there are differences, and that's my community that I grew up with. And so I am always of the mindset that I think that we are, in some ways with fiction, always writing outside of our own experience. I think where people really run into trouble is when they write about a group of people who are not people who are in their lives that they know, and so the only thing they know about that group of people is from other media they've absorbed. So I think I would have been much more, I don't know if the word is nervous or hesitant to write this book if I didn't have lots of close friends in my life who are Syrian, who have family members who have come over. And that's also why I really narrowed the experience of Jude's refugee story. So in my community, in Cincinnati, the Middle Eastern community of Cincinnati, the refugees that I know already have family in America. So their refugee story is similar to Jude's. And while it is very, very difficult, it is a much more privileged refugee story than the news stories we see that break my heart about the kids getting into these overcrowded boats and trying to reach shore in Europe or in Turkey. And that is so completely outside of the scope of my experience. I don't know anyone who has had that experience. And so while I could have done the research, I would have had to do so much research to gain access to someone who has had that experience. And so I felt more confident in being able to accurately and responsibly represent Jude's story, since I know so many people who have lived that experience. And the last thing I'll say is in my own family history, my father is the son of two refugees. And so there's a lot of discussion, and was always in my house, about what is home and hyphenated identities. And so I think it's something that like lives in my heart. And so this was a story that, while I have not, like I said, ever had to leave home, is something that, again, like I had an emotional access and connection to. And so I think it is, but it is so tricky. And, everything about the Middle East is tricky. The borders of the countries of what is Syria and what is Lebanon and what is Jordan were not drawn or decided by the actual people who live there. Those are boundaries that were drawn by a colonial power. And so there's lots of questions about what makes someone belong to one of these sort of nations. And I guess that's sort of where I fell down on feeling like I had enough people in my life who would help me, who could sensitivity read it, and my own, I guess, personal connection to the issue. But it is a tricky thing. It's something that I think about a lot, and I think the ground is always changing on that, and it's important to be aware. And I think that also to be honest about what the limitations of the own scope of your storytelling can be.
Thanks, Jasmine. We have interviews with dozens of other writers at our website, bookclubforkids.org. And if you know some young readers who would like to star on a future Book Club for Kids podcast, just send us an email and we'll send all the information. The email address is kitty@bookclubforkids.org. That's KITTY @bookclubforkids.org. And do check out our other podcast, The Fina Mendoza Mysteries. It's the story of a 10-year-old detective who solves the various mysteries inside the U.S. Capitol. It's free wherever you listen to podcasts.